Hello, my name is Ash.
And I'm Callie.
And welcome to Paved with Gold, the eating disorder recovery podcast. I would like to acknowledge the traditional landowners on which Callie and I are recording and extend the same respect to the traditional custodians of the lands from which you are all listening. I know we always say this, but this episode's like long overdue.
I think it's
The
like
fact
a
that
every episode thing.
Yeah. We're getting around to it, okay? And I also always say this, that, we need its own episode, and it should come as no surprise that this is its own episode because we mention it every bloody episode.
Literally every episode. And I think it's just because, like, I think every episode we genuinely record is, like, super exciting to us.
Yes, that is true.
Like, is actually something that's super interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's why.
Well, you guys know this from the title, but today we are going to be talking about trauma, how it interacts with our eating disorders, and the importance of trauma-informed care. Because A, no one should go into an eating disorder recovery system, or no one should go into the eating disorder recovery process and leave with trauma or have it exacerbated. And B, it is far, far too common in the mental health space, people living and dealing with trauma. So it goes without saying that this
noises. I think you know why I made them.
Yeah. So it goes without saying that this episode contains discussions of trauma and may contain subject matter or language that might be upsetting to some. So if you feel like this might be a triggering one for you, or you're not in the right space to listen, just skip this one. We'll see you in the next one.
Yeah.
But Callie, this is your wheelhouse. So I'm sitting in the passenger seat, flying off questions for you today. But before I'm excited.
I actually feel like wildly unprepared because I haven't actually fully read the questions. Also, I hope I actually know the answers.
You will, because you just wrote an entire workbook about it. So
yeah, but let's see how awake I am. No, I'm sure I will.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to give a really quick definition of trauma. So just we know what we're all talking about when we say trauma. So the Trauma-Informed Care Resource and Implementation Centre defines trauma as a pervasive problem that results from exposure to an incident or series of events that are emotionally disturbing or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, and or spiritual well-being. Traumatic experiences could include, but not limited to, physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, domestic or family violence, childhood neglect, living with a family member with mental health or substance abuse disorders, sudden unexplained separation from a loved one, poverty, illness from either yourself or a loved one, and yes, that does include eating disorders, racism, childbirth experiences such as a miscarriage or stillbirth, infertility as well can also be can also lead to trauma,
and birth.
And birth. Also being a witness to these events as well, like witnessing your loved one go through a traumatic childbirth or childbirth experience can be really, really tough. Any form of discrimination or oppression is traumatic as hell. Violence in the community, war or terrorism, and of course, unexpected traumatic events such as motor vehicle accidents, natural disasters, those kind of things. And that is definitely not even the entire list. There is more.
Isn't it funny? Sorry, I was just going to say, as you were saying that list, isn't it funny? Because typically you kind of get sold that it's war, or that you're a soldier and you've gone to war.
Yeah.
And but it's now it's literally anything.
Yeah. And as I was compiling this list, oh my fucking God, there are so many things that cause trauma. Yeah. And I know that we always say this, but why is trauma-informed care not standard?
And not just a standard, but I think it's very easy to call yourself a trauma-informed clinician or practitioner or worker or whatever, whatever role you're in.
Guidelines.
Yeah. So it's very easy to call yourself that, but it's another thing to actually be that.
Yeah. And but of course, no, toxic positivity is just a Band-Aid solution. Just be happy. Just choose happiness.
Whereas it's just, and I think I say this so often, you find people apologizing for the mood they're in, or apologizing for the way that they reacted to something or coped with something. And it's just oh my God, can we just actually leave space for the moment for how shit it is, the scenario that you're in currently, and how fucking incredible it is that you did what you could to survive.
Yeah. And this is the other thing is you should never have to apologize for the trauma that you've experienced.
Oh my God. Or
ever.
Yeah.
Because
it shouldn't have happened.
no, it shouldn't have happened. And also, I hate this, like, oh, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. It's like
Mm,
your trauma is not there to as an inspiration for other people.
no, no, you're not resilient. You shouldn't have had to be resilient. You don't have to be resilient now. You
Yeah, your
can.
suffering does not need to be inspiration for others.
Oh my God. It's honestly such the biggest gripe of mine. And it's something I think that's very prevalent in the eating sort of space as well,
Hmm.
which I will probably get into.
Yeah,
But
I actually did this is a, I did like I wrote out, I was in a really bad mood last week and just like feeling everything. And I
yeah.
wrote out like a massive rant about resilience and toxic positivity and all of
Good.
that. And it was really helpful. At some point, I'll
Yeah.
probably read it out because
I was
it
going to
was
say, I want to hear this.
like,
Because fuck it all. Like, and it's like people, like, that they're in a shit mood and they feel like they have to mask that shit mood, or they feel like they have to
Mhm.
like mask what they're going through for other people. And it's just like, no, like I'm happy to actually just sit here in the shit with you for a bit, because actually I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh, but have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Or what about this? Like, because so many people actually just need you to be there in the shit with them, rather than like invalidate the shit time that they're going through that day. Like,
Yeah.
I always say to all of my clients, like, oh, sorry, like that was really negative. I don't give a fuck if it's negative. Like,
It's
I
that's
would
what you're
rather
feeling and it's
you be
truth.
negative and show up in that way than like force yourself to be positive. Like,
Yeah.
it's, yeah. Anyway.
Like one of my least favorite questions was when I like, particularly when I'm particularly depressed or
Mm,
when I'm having a really shit time or kind of just like sitting in it, my
mm.
least favorite question is how are you? And it pisses me off because it's such like a standard, like, oh, how
You
are you? It's
actually
like,
want me to tell you?
exactly. Do you really want to know?
Yeah.
Or do you want me to like just put on the bandage? Yeah, fine, thanks.
Oh, it's such a
Yeah,
default.
thanks.
Sorry, there's a cat in my front yard. It's just walking past. Sorry, that just distracted me. It's like, whoa.
Callie's ADHD has entered the chat.
I'm unmedicated too, so it's like even more digging up my garden. Anyway, sorry.
Anyway, no, you're good. So,
Oh, the how are
oh,
you question.
yeah,
There we
yeah,
go. Here we are. Welcome
yeah.
back. Yeah, but and it's such a, like, I do it too. Like, I always, oh, how you going? And then I
Mm.
have to stop myself and I'm like, oh, and then I'm like, I ask the question again, I'm like, well, how are you really going? Like,
Mm.
because it's such a
Yeah.
default. Yeah, and it's something that I think everyone needs to work on, of like, I don't know, what else could you say? Like,
Even if it's like you could say, "You doing all right?" And if someone says no, you'd be like, "Do you want to talk about it?"
oh,
Nope. Cool. If you
but
do,
also
I'm here.
also if I'm a worker at a shop, I'll be like, I don't want you to talk about it.
Good point.
I like went to the hairdresser once. Like, I went to a hairdresser. It was for my graduation to get my hair done, and like, super nice. I was, how many weeks like postpartum was I? I think Blakey must have been like, oh, it would have been like 10 weeks old. And I went to the hairdresser to get my hair done for my graduation, and she asked me what I did for work, and I told her, big mistake. Big mistake. The
Because then it was
entire time it was just like unloading, and I was like, I'm like so tired. My daughter doesn't sleep. I have a newborn. Like, I just want to sit here in silence.
this is literally like your only time away.
Literally. And it's like, oh my God, I really struggle with it. And I'm like, so now, like, I source out hairdressers and stuff that do silent appointments, because
Love
I
that.
just have no extra spoons.
Your cup runneth over.
So I think it's also having that awareness, though, because then it's something that I try and practice with my friends, is asking, do you have the space
Mm.
to hear this right now, or do you
Yeah,
have the space
that's
to listen to my shitty day or whatever?
100%.
But anyway, that's
Yeah.
that's
That could be a whole other episode as
that's gonna
well.
say.
But
Yeah.
can you quickly define the differences
Hmm.
between the terms trauma,
Hmm.
PTSD, and CPTSD?
Yes, I can. So I'm going to start with CPTSD, because I think
It's the one you
it's
know the most.
it's what I know the most. But also, I think it really, once I explain CPTSD, I think you'll probably pretty clearly understand the differences.
Mm.
So CPTSD is basically, so complex post-traumatic stress disorder, for people who don't
Mhm.
know. It's all in the word complex, basically. So it's usually, I guess, characterized by trauma that has happened over a prolonged period of time. So that could be like every day for for 5 years, or every day for 10 years, or it's very common in childhood trauma. If you've come from a traumatic home life, or have been through like childhood sexual abuse as a child, it's something that has happened repeatedly, I guess, every day, especially as your brain is developing. It kind of like all trauma changes the brain, but it kind of like it's as your brain is developing, it kind of develops in a way that is kind of working around trauma, if that makes sense. So complex PTSD is often harder to treat because it doesn't respond as well to things such as EMDR, which I know we'll get into different trauma therapies later. So I'll define that a little bit later. It doesn't respond as well to kind of like, I guess, immediate trauma therapies that can work on particular scenarios, because it's not really a particular scenario that has traumatized you.
It's a long exposure.
It's kind of like a life. So I personally have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's from a few things. It's from, funnily enough, treatment, eating disorder treatment, the medical system, but also the domestic violence situation that I was at, because it wasn't kind of just the one scenario. Like it wasn't like, I guess, for example, a car accident or something like that, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. So then we take it back to PTSD and trauma. So I guess you can characterize that as sort of more of an event. And that does and that's it's not less than CPTSD. It's not like it's the lesser of. It's just as awful. It's just as hard to recover from and heal from. It's just as hard to cope with. It's just different. It's just different the way that it kind of shows up and the treatments and stuff that are used for it. So that can be more characterized, I guess, if you do have a traumatic medical event, or, a car accident, like I said, or sexual assault, or, those sort of things. It's important to note that all trauma changes the brain. It's like, I guess, a brain injury. And that, I think a lot of people are shocked by that, because they sort of think perhaps it's a choice that they've made, or like something, it's the way that, like, I guess they've perceived a situation, but actually we don't really get much choice in what our brain finds traumatic and what our brain doesn't find traumatic.
You mean we can't just get over it?
No, weirdly enough.
What, drink some cement, harden up, all that stuff? Yeah.
Yeah, no,
it's
not
amazing how that hasn't worked.
Or just like forgive the person and like just move on now.
Ugh.
It's time to leave it in the past. You can
Time
heal.
heals all wounds.
You can heal. You can but it is damage to the brain. Like it actually, if you look at scans of the brain pre and post trauma, it's your brain changes. Different things light up. You respond differently to different things. And so it's actually it changes the brain. A lot of people, especially with the CPTSD component of trauma, actually you could almost define it as a form of neurodivergence as well, because of the way your operating system has been changed. I guess the way that you relate to people, the way that you might interact with people, you might interact in the world, you might interact in relationships, in working systems and schooling systems and stuff might change because of the traumatic events you've been through.
Yeah, it's something that rings true when I listen to a person close to me who talks about it. They say that a lot of frivolous things like work spats or, tiny little things, they just look around and be like, this is so insignificant to what I've been through. It's like how
100%. Yeah, 100%.
Like how I can't believe you're sweating the small stuff over this when there's so many bigger things, which is not to say that one of the it's not be like, oh, well, so many people have it worse off than you. It's like, that's not what I'm saying. But it's more just it's not what I'm saying. It's more just it's kind of, as you were saying, as the way you described neurodivergency to me when in your episode, you said, I realized that I didn't fit into the world because the world is built specifically one way for a certain type of person.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
So I think, does that kind of define the differences?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, cool.
I mean, my next question was, you already sort of did this, but in terms of how trauma impacted your life, what role did that play in your eating disorder specifically?
Yeah. So in my eating disorder specifically, my eating disorder served as a coping mechanism. So probably that's probably even the wrong word to use. It served as a way for me to survive. So I guess the role it played for me is it kept me safe. It kept me small. It kept me obedient. It kept me in this role of, I guess, this perfect girlfriend, so that I didn't get in trouble. So I wasn't having to, I guess, be in danger. Which, it never really, like, it wasn't a great tool to use, but it was effective a lot of the time.
It makes sense.
It makes sense, yes. And, it was also, interestingly, I think, a tool for, my abuser, if we can call him that.
I think that would be a very fitting word. Yeah.
I don't know what else to, call it, really.
Dipshit is another word.
That's a good one. Could go DS. It was a way for them to control me, though, as well, which also kept me safe. So, I don't know if you remember this, Ash, but I think they were very much seen, especially in my treatment and my peers in treatment, he was very much seen as this thing that kept me going, that kept me alive. And he was like this incredible person that put up with Callie and, I guess kept me
Those were
going.
words that actually he said out loud.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. He said it to many, 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 many people. Lucky you to have to.
Like I said, dipshit.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. So he could use that. And my illness was something that he could use, through, I guess, to explain a lot of why he did bad things in the world. I can't go too much into what I mean by that because, but I guess it was kind of like, well, Callie, I'm dealing with so much with Callie and her illness. And, so I had to do this because we needed money, or we had to, sort of do that sort of stuff. So I guess that's sort of the role it played, my eating disorder played with that. Yeah. Does that answer the question? I can't remember the question.
Yeah, it did. So now let's talk, broadly speaking.
Yep.
What is the prevalence of trauma in general, and then what is the prevalence in terms of eating disorders?
Yeah. Okay. So this is going to be like a longer answer because I feel like we have
the floor is yours, Cal.
Well, I feel like we have data and stats and stuff for trauma, but I think this is such a huge component of people. It's not really something that, I guess, unless you see a psychiatrist, you're not going to be diagnosed for, if that makes sense. So we have sort of a statistic that says, I think it's around 50 to 70% of the general population will experience a traumatic event in their lifetime. So that's a lot. That's a lot. And look, the thing about trauma is that, like I said earlier, the way that your brain perceives, I guess, a traumatic event kind of decides whether, I guess, you have PTSD or you don't have PTSD. So that's trauma. So 50 to 70% of people, I guess, in their lifetime in Australia will experience a traumatic event. That doesn't mean that all of those people will go on to have PTSD or CPTSD, because it will be the way that your brain perceives it. So again, kind of I like to explain that to people because people think we have so much control over what we find traumatic or what impacts you, but we actually don't. So one traumatic event for one person might not actually have a lasting impact on somebody else. So that's kind of that statistic. So I can't give you an exact statistic for how many people have PTSD in Australia, to be honest. But that kind of explains that, I suppose. In terms of eating disorders, look, it's a similar statistic in that around 50% would, have diagnosable PTSD. However, I would argue, I think that it's closer to more of the 100% mark. And I say this because of treatment.
Anecdotally,
yes.
At least.
So, and look, this is more of now going into my thoughts around eating disorders and trauma and PTSD and CPTSD. More so than, I guess, what we can put statistics down to. Like we can't, because humans aren't statistics. That's kind of,
Yeah.
and we know with eating disorders, it's a really big struggle to be diagnosed with other comorbidities because you've got an eating disorder and everything is because of an eating disorder. So, it couldn't possibly be the fact that you're traumatized. It couldn't possibly be the fact that you have autism or ADHD. It's only because you have an eating disorder. So I say that because I think that our current system that so many people are fighting in to get treatment in is traumatic. And unfortunately, eating disorder treatment is trauma. And that's kind of why I say that. And like, that's not to say that everybody will then go on to have PTSD from eating disorder treatment. But if we think of the process of recovery or the process of going through treatment for an eating disorder, you're doing
Also
something
the
traumatic.
process of having an eating disorder.
Absolutely.
Living with an eating disorder is very traumatic.
Absolutely. The things that it kind of leads you to do. And also then the flow on, though, that has to the family systems or the people around you. So I actually talked to many carers who 100% would have diagnosable PTSD from their child's eating disorder.
Yeah.
I speak to parents that, like, oh gosh, like the thought of it like makes me tense up. And, I find my temper is just so much shorter now. And like, I can't, as soon as my phone rings, I'm like, I jump because it's like, oh my God, is there something like it's like that sort of stuff is actually triggers trauma responses. So it has like just a flow and effect to all of the other areas around you as well. So very rarely is it just like we talk about eating disorders and trauma. We also need to include other people around that person in that conversation as well. So yeah, I know like that probably didn't answer that question like specifically.
No, it did. It's like, and again, this is a very lame comment for me to make, but I've watched enough seasons of episodes of the show Intervention. And
I don't know what's that.
It's an American show where they hold interventions for people who have who are live with alcoholism, drug addiction, eating disorders, and those kind of things, and they all hold an intervention for that person. I'm sure it's like quite unethical, but
I was going to say it doesn't sound, but anyway.
Having like watched all of these episodes, and like 99% of all of the stories, there is a traumatic event in someone's life. And it makes sense. Like if you think about back to why people have eating disorders, a lot of the time they are coping mechanisms with something else, whether that's a coping mechanism for something traumatic that's happened, or it's a coping mechanism for another mental illness like depression or anxiety, or it's to cope with a coping strategy for neurodivergence when you just do not fit in the world, and it's like, well, I'm just going to turn everything on me.
You have no answer for that.
Yeah, which can be really traumatic.
100%. Oh, like majorly traumatic. Like, I guess forcing, you think of children, right? Like forcing them into the systems of the world, they're kind of, I always think about this, and I think about like, I guess Blake, right? Of, and I'm going to do my best. And I think that, this is something that I'm obviously so mindful of, but I always think about how, like, at what point in a child's life do we then like switch and be like, okay, now you have to actually fit into, like, you have to fit now into the world. And you see it in like parenting styles, right? Of like, no, they must do this because they have to become a member of society, which yes, has its merit. You can't, like you want your child to grow up to be able to be functioning in society. But I think it's really interesting when you look at what that means and what we're being taught as parents, because it's very neurotypical, even down to the way that they eat, even down to meal times, the way that we're, serving up food and like expecting them to kind of, do you know what I mean? So I just find that really interesting. And that is actually trauma for a child if they actually don't function in that way. And that's not the best way. Yeah, exactly right. Like it's like at the moment, terrifyingly, I'm looking at schools for Blake when, because you have to get onto wait lists super fucking early these days. It's terrifying. But for me, I'm like, I actually don't want her in the traditional schooling system because it horrifies me. And I know there's a lot of really good schools out there, and this isn't to say that, you know, there's incredible teachers out there that are, you know,
Yeah.
I think it's improving a lot. We're finding out a lot more things are changing. But however, for me, I sort of just think about like my experience at school and like feeling like I had to always do well to be a good kid. And I'm like, I just don't want her to get that message. Like,
Yeah.
I want
And
her to learn in a way that works for her.
yeah, like and it's that double-edged sword, right? You want her to be individual and learn the way that she wants to learn and
Yeah.
be her own person.
Yeah.
But at the same time, how much of school is
Mm.
conform or die? Like,
100%.
and if you don't fit
100%.
in, you will be
100%.
picked out and
Yep.
you will be singled out and you will be bullied mercilessly because
You'd be
kids
sent
are
to the special
assholes.
school. You'd be
Yeah.
sent to, taken out of the classroom rather than like what is
Or, "Oh,
actually
look
going
at
on
that
for this
weird kid."
child,
Yeah.
right? Like rather than, oh, this child learns, like even just like it's wild to me having to sit down in a classroom and just sit there and like for an hour to learn math or whatever. Like that
Mm.
actually like
Pretty
baffles me.
antiquated way of learning.
Well, like I don't learn that way. Like
Mm.
no wonder, no wonder I got moved every math class because, they're anyway. So I
Yeah.
think that's trauma too. And that can actually like then impact a kid as they grow up, and, might develop an eating disorder because of
Mm.
those systems that have been in place. So yeah, it's very, I think people think of trauma as a very specific thing and it's not a specific thing.
Yeah, I think the amount of the sheer number of things that can cause trauma should give
Anything.
you a general idea on how prevalent trauma is in society.
Absolutely.
And I mean, I know that like right-wing douchebags will probably be like, "Oh my god, everyone's so sensitive about everything.
Uh,
Everyone gets triggered at everything."
Snowflakes.
It's like, well, yeah, and then they call us the snowflakes, yet they get,
Honest and
mad
then, like,
about,
it's like, "Mate, like, look at your reaction online. Are you joking?"
okay, who's the snowflake now?
Honestly.
Anyway, moving on.
I feel like we
So
could go that rant forever.
So how does trauma manifest in the mind and the body? And then I've got a second question, which is how
Mhm,
how trauma affects the brain biologically. Although I think
mhm.
you did cover that already. But
Yep,
specifically, how does it manifest in mind and body?
yep. So, I think when people do think of trauma or, like, a trigger, I guess, to, that might trigger trauma,
Mm,
they sort of think of it as, like, something like, again, that's just in their brain,
mm,
that is kind of like, your brain has chosen to respond that way, but actually it's a physiological response as well. So,
mm.
it doesn't just show up as, like, a thing in your brain. It actually like, and you probably know, Ash, like if you've ever been triggered by something, you get like the classic symptoms of, I guess, maybe the racing heart or the clammy hands or the shakiness or being unable to speak, or we sort of talk about like
That adrenaline feeling.
yeah, like you can't, like it's different for everybody, but I know for
Mm,
myself, like I will like choke up and like I can physically feel in my chest and my throat this kind of like block. And like if I try and talk, it's kind of like trying to like cough something up. And that's how
mm.
it shows up for me. And I feel myself kind of go faint and like kind of just tap out of the world. That's how it kind of shows up for me, and it will be different for everybody, how it shows up. Some people, like I said, will go shaky, they'll get the clammy hands, they'll get, you know we kind of think about, we can bring
You might
into
get
this.
angry
Yeah.
because like
I
it
was
can
about
trigger
to
real.
say it can trigger the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response. Did I
Mm.
did I list all of those right? Just then fight, fight. Oh, God, I can't. Fight, fight,
Fight, fight,
fight,
flight.
flight, freeze, and fawn.
Yeah.
So a lot of people don't. Most people have heard of fight, flight, and freeze, and that's in the, like you said, getting angry. They might want to fight back and kind of like explode, and like it's a very common trauma response to a trigger, or flight, run away from the situation, hide from the situation, or not put themselves in that situation at all.
Mm.
Freeze, where I get freeze quite often, where it's kind of like just you freeze, like it's like I can't, or it might
You
look
can't do
like
anything.
you can't do anything, or it might look like, sometimes that looks like for me like freezing, like I can't get out of bed, if it's
Mm.
been really like a really huge trigger. Um, or like I've had a trauma episode, then like it might feel like I'm frozen in bed and like time just passes and I don't really notice that time passing. The other one is fawn, and a lot of people haven't heard of that one. And so fawn is when is very common with CPTSD, especially because it's basically like people pleasing.
Yeah.
So
like,
just
no, I'm
wanting
fine.
to make
Yep,
sure,
it's fine. Okay, sure.
yeah,
Whatever.
not wanting to rustle people's feathers, just being agreeable. Somebody might say something to you that you wildly disagree with, but you'll just agree with them so you don't have a fight, or you don't have to like speak up, or you don't. I do fawn quite a lot as well, like with particular types of people, especially men. If they kind of like disagree with me, I will just fawn because it's unsafe for me. It might not actually be unsafe for me to.
But your history has taught you that it is an unsafe thing for you.
Exactly right. And, that's something I've obviously worked on now, and now I'm a lot better with it. But for a lot of people, that's a really common reaction. And a lot of people don't see that as a trauma response.
But it's like you're retreating into yourself. It's like, no, I'm just going to say what I need to keep safe.
It comes down to safety. It all comes down to safety, like what is going to keep me safe. Because you think about it in the sense of like, I guess, an animal, right? Like, so you think of in the jungle like a small animal who's about to be attacked by a tiger. What do they do? And it's all about like becoming safe. And so they will sometimes go through these trauma responses to make themselves safe. And it's not dissimilar.
Yeah. It's the classic victim blame. Why didn't you fight back?
Oh,
because
100%.
I tried to stay alive. That's why.
Yeah, because you did the best you could. You did what you could in the scenario and with the tools that you had to stay alive and to stay safe. And there is nothing that anybody could criticize anybody for in those scenarios. It also looks like, if we wanted to look at links between relapse and, relapse across the spectrum. So with eating disorders, addiction, whatever it is, it's people often see like, oh, I've relapsed, like I failed, I'm back to day one. You often see in the addiction world, like the counters, which is incredible. Like, let's celebrate that. But then, something happens and, you think
you get to the shame of having to reset that counter.
It's like, it's day one again. It's like, well, actually, can we actually just look at how long you went for, A, but also B, what happened? What actually happened? What triggered you? And then also look at your entire life and look at what has helped you cope through really hard shit in your life. Has it been addiction? Has it been eating disorders? And, so now, okay, so you've relapsed, but also, was that your body actually doing a really functional thing for you? Was it you doing the best you could in that moment to keep yourself safe? So maybe we don't need to look at this as like a relapse. Maybe we can look at this as like as a bit of a lapse. Can we pick ourselves up from here and kind of look at it in the context of things rather than just throwing it all out the window now and now I'm back to day one?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's like a huge passion topic of mine, because I think it also, if we think of it in the link of eating disorders and we think of the pressures of the world, and I guess our concept of recovery maintenance as well, is that especially if you have trauma, you're very, very, very likely to come up against a lot more triggers than somebody who doesn't have, I guess, trauma. And so if you have a trigger and say you have that eating disorder thought, or you have that, maybe you have a small lapse, that doesn't mean you've relapsed. It doesn't mean you've done anything bad. It means that you were trying to keep yourself safe. And yes, it is ideal for us to come up with other ways to keep you safe and other tools. But sometimes when you're in that really big trigger trauma moment, it's like you will do whatever you can to make yourself safe. And sometimes it does look like that. And that doesn't mean that you have failed.
No. It just means that nothing else has worked and you go back to your sort of like default. And that's fine.
And we talk about like when you are in a trigger that you go into your reptile brain. So it's almost like you're survival. You're in survival mode. And sometimes when you're in survival mode, and this is why we also talk about when we come up with tools and other healthier coping mechanisms to help with trauma and triggers, etc. This is why we talk about practicing them before you're actually in a trigger. So that it is more natural and more accessible for your reptile brain to access than when you are in the actual trigger trauma situation. where, you know, perhaps you haven't practiced, you haven't got those tools under your belt yet, your reptile brain, your survival brain can't actually easily access those tools. And so that sort of explains why, I guess, people will go back to particular maladaptive coping mechanisms, because it helps in the moment, it's effective. It is obviously doesn't necessarily help in the long run. And so that's why we talk about actually having these tools practiced and thought out and planned before triggers happen. Yeah.
Yeah. I always, I think I've mentioned it before, but the way that I sort of interpret, like, because I think trauma can be quite hard to understand for some people, like how it can have such a massive effect on people's lives if they haven't lived with it.
Yeah.
Is your entire, I think of it as like the great filter of everybody of our lives. It's like you've got like, you're here and like you've got this filter in front of you that is made up of every single thing that you've experienced, every interaction you've had, every exposure to whatever it is. I think it's very similar to fertile soil, right?
Yeah,
And
100%.
it's whatever is put into that filter, like some things stick, some things don't, but everything from that point, once you have sort of this filter, which is constantly ever evolving, everything interaction that you have has to pass through that filter, and it might ping off to a bunch of different things. It might remind you of something in your childhood. It might remind you of something that your friend said to you the other day, which is why I use it in terms of advertising, which is and ideas and stuff, which is obviously my job. But which is why like no one will relate to something. Like I could look at something and someone else could look at the same thing and we have interpreted it in completely different ways because of based on this filter of what we've all experienced and how we've gone through life and what experiences have enriched our lived experience.
Absolutely.
And if you've got trauma in there, that's it, and something comes through that filter and it pings one of those trauma in that filter, it's going to set off a massive trigger, which is why one person might react to something in a completely different way to another person. And you'll be like, you're just overreacting. Like, no. Think about what that person is reacting to and what's set off in their brain.
Absolutely. And often it isn't actually just like, so the thing that might trigger somebody might seem really trivial. And it might be like, if you like, you know, objectively it could be trivial, but triggers come in the form of like anything. It could be smells, it could be sights, it could be like a place, it could just be a person,
it
could be a word, it could be like that person's wearing a hat, it could be like, you know, absolutely anything. And I think it's interesting you've brought into the concept of fertile soil, because it's actually really relevant, I think, with the impacts of trauma. And I guess protective factors of, you know, whether that goes on to develop PTSD or CPTSD.
If you guys don't know what we're talking about, fertile soil is in our episode with Lucy Dahill.
Yes, go listen to that.
I think it's episode 16 or
Yeah.
something like that. Yeah. So we
in
talk
like
about fertile soil, the analogy.
Yeah. So in a snapshot, I guess fertile soil is like, you know, like growing a plant. Depending on what you put on the plant will determine whether it grows healthy, in inverted commas, or, you know, like, does that like, that kind of explains it. So if you think of like, Lucy, like it's the best concept. I use the concept so often. But like, so if your fertile soil has been like, you've been in a really incredible upbringing, like really healthy upbringing, not much trauma into childhood, you know, like, yes, just sort of normal kind of life stuff, then you're probably so much better equipped to be able to kind of handle you know, scenarios or life stresses or, you know, whatever traumatic events than somebody whose fertile soil has been a life of, you know, from the get-go not having very good fertile soil. So that's a huge impact as well. But you're 100% right, Ash. How I perceive a particular scenario is going to be wildly different to maybe how you perceive it. And that's why I always use a really silly analogy of like, if you've broken your fingernail and that traumatizes you and that like sets you off, I can't say to you that like it's just a broken fingernail, it'll grow back, because I don't know what that impact has actually had on you. I don't know what's happened in your brain at that point of time, and maybe it has been a really big trigger for you, and now you've gone into your survival mode. And it's not up to me to be like, discredit that. It's now up to me, you know, if I'm able to. And I guess with my clients, you know, okay, cool, awesome. Now, how do we break that cycle? How do we break that circuit now? Because the most important thing when you get into a trigger response or you get into a trauma episode is breaking the circuit, is kind of coming back into your rational brain. And that the best way that we can do that is using tools, is using, you know, whether that's grounding activities, whether that's breathing, whether that's water, whether that's, you know, whatever tool is under your repertoire to break that circuit. That's what we need to do.
Iz talked about that in their episode with us, where they would use an ice bath, like
incredible tool.
Putting their hand in an ice, a bowl of ice, and you know, to stop them from self-harming.
Incredible tool.
Somewhat. I've used the holding ice cubes in my hand before because
incredible tool. An ice pack or putting your head into it, or some people will use you know, like rubber bands and like flicking the rubber bands on their wrists.
I have a Shakti mat, which is one of those mats with like spikes on it.
The spiky things. Yep. I personally love anchoring. So for me, a huge component of my CPTSD is nightmares. And so I use something called anchoring, which kind of reminds my brain that I'm not back in an unsafe scenario. And so if I wake up from a nightmare, for example, I've got something next to my bed that I can look at saying pretty much, you know, like, you're not back there. It's the year 2024 now. Your name is Callie Pute. You live at this address. Your partner, your fiance now, your fiance is Drew Cote. You have a daughter, you know, reminding your brain, bringing your brain back to the rational of real life rather than sort of allowing it to stay into that survival reptile brain of like, I'm back there, the panic of like, oh my God, shit. It kind of pulls me back to reality. And so that's another really cool tool that I love using as well.
Yeah. So I know you talked about it before, but how does trauma affect the brain neurologically, biologically?
Yeah. So it's damaged the brain.
Yeah.
So it actually physically changes the makeup of your brain. So like I said, you can kind of see on scans of the brain, pre-trauma, post-trauma. You can see.
Wow, that's insane.
It has actually changed. Yeah. So it's not like you've just like perceived something in a particular way. You're thinking about something a particular way. No. It's actually changed the way that your brain works. So, and the best way that I explain it is that it's damaged the brain. And it can be changed again, like brains can be changed. And we talk about these neural pathways that can be changed, but it's very likely for a lot of people, especially with CPTSD, it's kind of like a lifelong thing. Yeah. And it's more so like adapting to like, okay, so this is how my brain works now, and adapting to that and knowing how to work with it and knowing what tools to have and what things to use in particular scenarios. When it comes to PTSD, I'm not going to say it's not easier. It's not easier whatsoever.
It's just different.
It's different. Yeah. So we have really incredible therapies that you can do, such as EMDR. I think I mentioned that a little bit. I don't know if this is a question. Is there a question about?
It's fine. Just keep going.
Because I think it just explains, I guess, the way the brain works. So we have really incredible therapies such as EMDR, which is, I'm going to butcher this, is eye movement desensitization, EMDR, reprocessing.
Nailed it.
Did I? Yes.
Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing.
Yeah. So what that basically is it's a particular type of very pointed trauma therapy that focuses.
Would you like a definition? Because I've got one right here.
Go for it.
It is a psychotherapy treatment that is designed to alleviate the distress associated with traumatic memories, according to the EMDR Institute.
Absolutely right. So that explains it perfectly. So, and what that involves is, to like explain it a little bit further, I suppose, is if you have like a particular traumatic event, you know, you can actually reprocess it. You can use EMDR. So your brain has processed this trauma in a particular way, and that is what makes it traumatic. And so what this therapy kind of aims to do is reprocess that memory. So reprocess that memory in the way that it isn't as traumatic anymore. It might still give you kind of like, oh, I don't like that. That wasn't nice, but it reprocesses in a way so that it doesn't, I guess, impact you to the point of it being a huge trigger, or it doesn't going into a trauma episode. It just sort of is like, oh, that's just not a nice memory, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I guess, yeah, that kind of like is a way to kind of like, I guess, help your brain process it. Because I guess that's another relevant thing with PTSD. It's like I've said, it's the way your brain processes a traumatic event that is key. And that's going to be different for everybody. But we actually don't get to choose how our brain processes it. But we can then go do things that helps our brain to process it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
So we always bang on about trauma-informed care. What is it, and what does it look like, and why is it important? Even though I think we've kind of talked about why it's important, but yeah.
It's just mad to me that people like don't source out how to actually be trauma-informed. So I think if you're working with humans, you're working with trauma. I think that's particularly relevant within the eating disorder space. Like I sort of touched on earlier, eating disorder treatment and having an eating disorder itself is actually traumatic. So if you're working with someone with an eating disorder, you can pretty much assume that they probably have trauma in some sense, whether that be an event, whether that be CPTSD, or whether that's because of treatment or because of what they've
From
had
the eating disorder itself.
Eating disorder, exactly right. So trauma-informed care is basically being aware of that, aware that every person that you come into contact to likely has some form of trauma. And the goal with treatment is to not re-traumatize people, or you're not meant to make trauma worse, that's for sure. Unfortunately, it does. It can, rather, not for everybody, but it can, which is the way the system. And sometimes, sometimes it is unavoidable. If somebody is quite medically unwell, then there is unfortunately measures that do have to be taken. But I think it's really important in that to make sure that we're doing treatment with somebody rather than to somebody. And I think that comes into trauma-informed care. And what that might look like is that, so maybe their treatment, like they can't have a huge say in like their treatment because they're not, they're not sort of in the brain space to do so. But I always think that there is a way that somebody can be in the driver's seat. Yeah, there's always a way that you can give them autonomy. I think of so many of my clients and so many people, and certainly myself, who had a lot of my rights taken away, had a lot of my choice taken away. And, with my choice being taken away, it was just completely not thinking of like what else I had going on. I always remember going to an emergency once at a hospital, and I remember, just the way that they treated me. And I had come from Sydney. I had flown from Sydney to Queensland for treatment, and knowing what I had come from in Sydney, because I was, like, oh, you're not allowed to have treatment in Sydney again. You've got to go to Queensland and come back when you're better. And then to go into this medical system and to this treating system where I was treated like absolute shit, it's wild to me that every single medical professional, every single person coming into contact with a human doesn't think about the way that they are interacting with the person, how that could impact somebody. Yes, there were particular things that had to be done. Yes, I had to get a cannula put in, but you could have done that in a particular way that wasn't traumatizing. And I think it's just always, always, always being aware of your actions on somebody else and how that could actually be impactful. And I think it's I just don't think it's hard to be trauma informed. It's just, don't be a dick. No, but I don't know if that explains what trauma informed care is, but I think it's always been mindful that every human you come into contact with, you have the potential to traumatize them, and you must not traumatize them further.
Well, it comes down to what we always bang on about, which is client-centered care, individualized treatment.
Absolutely.
And if you treat the person, the
like
patient, as a person,
like a
then
human.
you're halfway there, really.
I had an incredible interaction with a doctor in the medical system yesterday with a client, and the way that he spoke to her, the way that he genuinely was concerned and like explaining things to her. It was incredible. And I just thought to myself, if every doctor was like you in the medical system, like, and it didn't take any extra time out of his day. He was still doing his job, but he was giving her the autonomy. Even though a lot of her autonomy had been taken away, it was still giving autonomy. And I think it's just so, it did, like I said, it didn't take him any extra time.
Yeah.
So yeah, I hope that like kind of answers. And I think that if you're working in this space, you should be sourcing out extra training in trauma.
Well, one thing you can do is
Buy my workwork.
yes, which is in the description below. Click
Yes,
that link
please
because
do.
I think we chatted about this on our episode with Kai
Mm,
about how even one doctor or one clinician, one nurse who
absolutely.
actually seeks out the training in terms of whether that be
Absolutely.
upskilling for LGBT folk
Hmm.
and or being trauma informed or
Yeah.
doing Nick McDermott's fat positive framework because
Because that's
yeah,
trauma too.
exposure to anti-fat bias is trauma.
It's part of being trauma informed.
Yes. So
Doing these
all of
trainings and sourcing out these trainings is part of being a trauma informed practitioner.
yes, because the amount of trauma that people in the LGBTQIA plus community go through,
Oh my
the
God.
amount of trauma that fat people are exposed to
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
horrific.
Wild.
It was in our list, right?
Hmm.
Being discrimination and oppression are one of the causes of trauma. So
Absolutely.
if you are not doing the
Absolutely.
work there, then you are not trauma informed.
And it's there. Like there are
Yeah,
so many people who are offering it.
yeah.
And
It's all the
like
resources are
it's
there.
there.
It's
It's
not
there.
it's not a requirement by the system. It should be,
It should
but
be 100% should be.
you should absolutely take it on yourself. If you've gotten into the medical field to help improve patients' lives and you want to make a real difference in how you treat eating disorders, think about why you got into this field, right? If it's to help people, then this should be your own requirement. I think Dr. Ashalali
100%.
was talking to it as well in our episode on medical weight stigma.
Mm,
Yes, the system needs to change. It might not change as fast as you
mm,
personally can. So
100%.
looking at your values and how
Yep.
you can
Yep.
change your practice to meet with your values. If your
Mhm.
values are, I don't want to harm a patient, then
Mhm.
you need to become trauma informed. And that means you need to commit to complete all the training that is available,
Absolutely.
ideally by people with lived experience with trauma, as being a member of the LGBTQIA plus community, and people who are lived experience as as fat folk.
Mhm.
Listen to these people.
Mhm. They're telling you, like, it's there. No, 100%, and I guess, like, my workbook as well, not to, like, plug it,
Plug it.
but also maybe a little. What I aim to do with it as well is to make it really practical, and I think, it's very practical, I guess, for, uh, clients, like, for, folk who are going through eating or just trauma. Is not as specific to eating disorders, it's across the spectrum. So it's very practical for them, but I think it's also really practical for practitioners as well because it's tools that they can actually use with their clients, and but also kind of think about things in a different way. Like if they're working with a particular client, like they might be like, oh, okay, like they're telling me about NIMES and stuff. Like I remember seeing in this workbook, like, oh, this could be really helpful. So like maybe we could work on, like, it kind of just gives little ideas. And I kind of designed it so, a clinician can actually like use it as a worksheet and be like, this is something really tangible that you can do. And anybody can kind of use it in that way. I tried to make it really simple to use, but really practical to use as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Go click that link right now. It's in the description. I don't know what you're doing here. Click if it's safe to
Thanks
do
for
so, not
listening
while
to us.
driving.
Yeah, but not while you're driving, please.
Yeah. So the
Yeah.
last question I have, and I know you've talked about it before, but I think it's always important to keep all of like the trauma stuff in this one episode so
Mhm.
that it's a complete thing.
Mhm.
We talk often about how, yes, eating disorders often are a symptom of trauma, but also oftentimes you can only treat, if you've been traumatized by your eating disorder or eating disorder treatment, you can only treat that trauma after you've,
Yeah.
But my,
Yep.
my question is, how important is it to treat your trauma separately as well as alongside eating disorders? You can't just lump it all into one.
No, you can't. And like I think we said earlier, like how often do we hear like, oh, that's just your eating disorder, like kind of, that's just your eating disorder, putting everything down to an eating disorder. And it's like, and it's just makes me actually really angry. It's really important to note for a lot of people if they are malnourished, or are really active, I guess, in eating disorder cognitions, that it can be dangerous to address trauma whilst you're in those cognitions, because your brain is in a safe space to do so. And so introducing extra stimulus into the brain when it's already, I guess, really so deep and fragile, exactly, that's a good word to use, can actually be really dangerous and can lead to some really horrible outcomes. And so I know we hear a lot of people say like, oh, they're not even addressing, what's actually going on. They're just addressing like the food. And sometimes that is actually really necessary.
Put it this way, you wouldn't start doing physio on a knee that hasn't had surgery yet.
Literally. Yeah, exactly right. So it's really important to note that, and to note that your trauma absolutely should and can be worked on, but you do need to be in a space to do so. Otherwise, it can be really dangerous. It's why I guess, we see so much with eating disorder folk, that dissociative sort of state. They kind of go dissociative because really their brain can't handle any more stimulus. And dissociation isn't always a bad thing, that's for sure, because it is your body and your brain's way of noticing that, hey, I actually have reached my limit. I can't actually handle anymore. So I'm going to tap out now and dissociate and shut down, so that like it's a protective thing, and it's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
So we noticed that already with so many folk with eating disorders, especially if you do have trauma present, is because your brain just shuts down. And it's why when people start becoming, I hate this word, but more nourished, I guess nutritionally rehabilitated, that's better, that they start remembering more things, that more memories start coming up. And so I really implore everybody, like practitioners, that when those memories do start coming up, that's a good time to start, because it's not like I hear all the time, but if we bring it up, if they're having these memories, and if we feed into it, it's going to make it worse. Well, it's not. They're thinking about it anyway. It's kind of the same rhetoric as suicide. You're not just introducing a new concept into their brain. They're already thinking about it. So I really think that that's a good time to start it. But like you said, you nailed it. An eating disorder isn't there just for no reason. It's there for a reason. And so once those symptoms start coming up of trauma, then it's really important then to address those symptoms and give tools and skills and other means to cope with this stuff. Otherwise, of course, they're going to turn back to their eating disorder, because they don't want to feel these things. You don't want to feel the pain of trauma. You don't want to feel the pain of the triggers coming up. So what's really effective in numbing that? My eating disorder. And if we have a system that's kind of like, well, too bad, we've just got to get you to recover from your eating disorder, then we do it. It's kind of like, well, we see people then shift into a severe and enduring category, because things are never actually addressed, and treatments aren't working on them. Well, because you're not actually addressing what is actually going on, and you're ripping a coping mechanism out from underneath them without replacing it. So it is vital to recovery. It is so vital to recovery, because the eating disorder is often there to numb the trauma, to numb the memories. I don't want to feel these things. I don't want to have nightmares. I want to sleep. I don't want to have to wake up every single night and all be scared to go to sleep. So I'm going to use my eating disorder so that sort of stuff doesn't come up. So it is absolutely vital to recovery. And some people will recover and continue to work on their trauma. I know that was certainly my situation, that, I started EMDR and stuff after I recovered, because that was a safer time for me to do so. However, during what was pivotal in my treatment and helping me to recover was having a team that didn't just leave my trauma there to fester, that didn't just leave it there and not address it. They addressed it in appropriate ways and safe ways until I could get to a space to be able to do the really hard work in trauma. And it helped me to recover because it was actually being addressed. So it's vital.
No, that makes total sense. And I hope that people listening to this can even if you like take it to your treatment team and say, hey guys, listen to this. This is what I need you to do for me. And,
I hope it made sense.
really, try and advocate for yourself as best as you can in this space and be
like I said, it's not like it's, asking them to do trauma therapy with you.
No.
It's asking them to acknowledge and leave space and help with coping tools and mechanisms, like other things that they can do to help cope with that stuff and leave space for that stuff to exist, rather than asking them to squash it back down and not address it yet, because it's not, it's, yes, they need to be safe, but once those memories start coming up, you can't just squash those back down without using something unhealthy to squash it back down if you're not actually giving tools then to actually help. And again, this is kind of where was a really huge consideration for making the workbook, was that it's practical, immediate stuff that people can use in the interim, before they, I guess, do EMDR and stuff like that.
Amazing. And there's a bunch of resources, especially on the Inside Out Institute website for those in Australia, and I'm sure there's other directories around the world for you to seek out trauma-informed practitioners. And even if you have to ask if someone says they're trauma-informed, ask, what have you done to make yourself trauma-informed?
What does that mean to you?
What does that mean to you? And what does that mean if I have treatment with you? Ask that question, because then you know exactly what they've done and if they're just saying that they've done it.
Yeah, exactly right. Like I said at the very beginning, it's one thing to say you're trauma-informed, but it's another thing to actually be trauma-informed. Yeah. 100%.
Well, I think we could talk about this. I'm sure we'll probably do like a part 2 episode, because I feel that there's still way more to talk about, but I think this really covers the basics of it. So thank you so much, Callie.
It's my absolute pleasure.
I know this is a real passion for you, so I really appreciate that you sharing all of this, and I've learned a bunch as well.
I hope so.
I have.
Good.
So thank you.
My absolute pleasure. It is a huge passion topic of mine, and I could go for hours. So.
And also, if you're a clinician and would like further training as well, I know that Callie offers this kind of stuff, or offers this training. So please reach out to her as well. Or if you, just reach out to her, because I'm sure that she can either do it herself or recommend someone who can.
Absolutely.
That's all for today's podcast. Thank you so much for listening. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe to make sure you don't miss an episode. And if you like what you're hearing, we'd love if you gave us a little 5-star rating or a review on Apple Podcasts. That would really help us out. You can follow us on Instagram at pavedwithgoldpod, send us an email at pavedwithgoldpod@gmail.com, or visit our website, pavedwithgoldpodcast.com. All of those links will be in the show notes, along with extra resources as per usual. And until next time, stay safe, and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye.
Bye.
This podcast is general in nature and has not taken your personal circumstances or medical history into account. We are here to share our own experiences and the things that we have found helpful throughout our own personal recovery journeys. Please remember that each person's journey and circumstances are different, and not all of the information contained in this podcast may be relatable to you. It's important you consult your own GP or recovery team to seek out tailored advice before making any important decisions relating to your own health and recovery process. If you have found any of the content in this episode distressing, please contact your care team or a medical professional. If you or someone you know is in crisis and needs help now, please contact emergency services in your region immediately.